Hello, all, and welcome to the Absurdist Podcast, the outlet, the conduit, and the voice closest to the truth. I am your host, Caleb Silveira. We live in an absurd time, and that is why you're listening to the Absurdist Podcast. My guest today is Professor Ron Dart, currently at the University of the Fraser Valley. He has published over 40 books on political philosophy, key political figures, and religion. He is a hobby mountaineer and has also penned many articles on the subject. Did I miss anything, Ron?
Nope, that's just fine.
Okay. So I think for today we're going to start by going over your book, the North American High Tory Tradition. Now we're not going through the whole thing because it is quite a tome, and that would be much too lengthy for a 40-minute podcast. Instead, we're going to go over the Tory manifest at the beginning. I'll do your 10 points, and then you can have a response to each of the points, 2 to 3 minute response. And then I'll ask a few pointed questions at the end.
Yeah, sounds good.
So first, Tories are concerned about the wisdom of tradition, the insights of the past, and the truths learned about the human condition by those who've gone before us.
Yeah, so a commentary, a reflection on that would be probably one of the major illnesses we face today as a culture, not only in the West, but in other places, is the illness of memoricide, which means lack of memory, essentially. And we all know if we were to go to bed at night and wake up in the morning and have no memory, it would be very difficult to orient because we orient through memory. And the same with culture and a civilization. Where there is no memory, we can understand why things fragment so much. People find it difficult to understand what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is better, best. Because the wisdom of thousands of years, we forfeited, we bartered away. And so it leaves people bereft of the markings for the trail, the map, the compass, and how to understand identity, how to understand culture, how to do education, how to make sense of religion, how to do politics and economics. And there's also a level of arrogance in it, or what C.S. Lewis would call chronological snobbery. When we think the newest is the best, and this is a product of a certain type of progressive notion of liberalism, the newest is the best. And so anything in the past is generally discarded or seen as subordinate. Now, a Tory comes along, particularly a high Tory comes along and says, there must be an ongoing conversation between the wisdom of the past, the insights in the present as we move into the future. Similar to Burke's famous saying, what is democracy? It's the voice of the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. And so a Tory is interested in that sense in a much bigger conversation. And not demeaning the past, but seeing there's insights and blindness in the past, but not genuflecting to the present and being uncritical about the mood of the present, as if whatever is said is almost, ex cathedra. Liberalism cannot be criticized in any way. And so this is why the first point was, if no memory, how do you orient? How do you have a conversation about anything? And so it's a call to basic intellectual, cultural humility.
So it's taking notice of the cairns of the past and understanding where they fit on our journey.
Absolutely, yes. And as I said, without markings, without a map, without a nookshook, as it were, with the, it's hard to navigate in the landscape of the modern world. And of course, some make a virtue of no cairns, no landscape. All is just perspective, hermeneutical generosity, fragmentation, pluralism. Well, this leaves people in a very precarious place when it comes to making meaningful decisions as a culture.
Yeah, well, I understand that the point, but I think it's also a point of neither demonizing or deifying the past or the present. It's a balanced perspective, trying to find your way without taking your idols or taking your demons to the heart.
Yeah, and this is where you'll tend to get a fragmentation in terms of people are grappling with this. Some idealize the past. It's sort of a golden age without recognizing it's a complicated story, a complicated polyphonic story. So there's good and bad, wheat and tares. And these type of people, sort of hyper reactionaries, then demonize the present, the best elements of liberalism. There's others who just idealize liberalism and demonize the past. Well, that's equally small-minded and reactionary. And a Tory says there has to be an ongoing dialogue between past and present, dialogue within the past and a dialogue within the present. And that leads to a healthy political, philosophic, religious vision.
So one is a train and one is sort of a cyclical version of history, while the other one's an ever-going, plowing forward train. And you don't really want to take either completely in cement. You want to look at history as a potential cyclical journey, but not cement it as history is going to repeat itself, and not just be like, well, history has no relevance, so it's just us in the train going forward, and we should ignore all past historical significance.
Yeah, that's a very small-minded way of understanding how we move forward. You reject the past, and inevitably you're perpetually repeating the problems of history. I mean, people do that anyway, but at least history can be a warning sign. It can be a flag held up saying there'll be dragons there if you go down this path.
All right. Let's move on to point 2. I think that was a very good micro discussion. So the second point that Ron has here is Tories have a passion for both the commonweal and the commons, the good of the people, of the nation, of each and all. It is the foundry notion of Tory thought.
Yeah, so the notion of the commonweal or the commonwealth, or a Catholic vision, Catholic just means katholos, according to the whole, is again an attempt to find a via media between, on the one hand, sort of a runaway individualism. Each individual is primarily concerned with themselves, their wants, their inflated needs, and the other is the problem. And so each must tend for their own wants, desires, hopes and dreams. And if others can contribute to that, fine and good. But if not, the individual takes priority over the community or the common good. The leftist side of that, which is equally problematic, is the individual gets swallowed up into the collective. And so this collectivism and individualism are the two extremes, or excessive attention to autonomy versus the common good versus a collective which ignores the important elements of the individual. And so the commonweal, or the commonwealth in that sense, is each and all within a Tory perspective are concerned what makes for the good of one and all in their journey, without slipping into reactionary individualism on the one hand, or a worrisome collectivism on the other hand. And so once again, we can see the Tory living in this dynamic tension, just as previously between past, present, future, there's a tension you live in. So between collectivism and individualism, there's the commonweal and the commonwealth. Much more difficult to live with than more sort of simplistic reductionisms of the right or the left.
Well, it's a hyper individualistic society we live in, and I think that's why the left type of philosophy is so attractive, because when you have such a hyper individualistic society, people don't know how to identify themselves, so they latch on to these ideologies.
Yeah, and that's absolutely understandable, because individualism pushed too far leads to loneliness, it leads to isolation, it leads I'm connected to nobody, eventually to depression. You follow that reductio ad absurdum, there's tragic consequences. So the human longing to be knit together, to be part of something, then leads to various forms out of desperation, just to not be so isolated and live with loneliness, is then collectivism, or looking for some sort of community. Then often people attach themselves to some of the most bizarre political ideologies just so they have a sense of being a part of something. So they end up sacrificing their intellect and critical faculties, but the human longing for connection overrides a certain type of individualism that isolates people.
So this is sort of more of a Grantian question, but the idea of technology in a consumerist age, how would that affect the high Tory vision of commonwealth individualism and a tendency to group ideology?
Well, within Toryism, you have two elements. There's, when it comes to knowing and being, one is techne, the notion that somehow through our skill, our abilities, our training, we can make the world into what we want it to be, versus paideia, which is a tradition. That's more the Greek tradition. Humanitas in Latin is the Latin tradition, in which there is mystery, there's ambiguity, there's uncertainty when we get to things like religion and politics and ethics and aesthetics. And so the notion with techne, we can solve all problems, fix all difficulties. There's a sense of hubris in that, whereas the paideia humanities tradition is there is mystery, there is ambiguity in the human journey. And again, living in the tension between what technique can deliver, but what it cannot deliver, what it conceals, but what the humanities or paideia reveals that technique conceals from us. And so Grant and many modern thinkers, Heidegger and others, were very concerned with the technocracy in that sense, the rule of technique, that we would sort out all the human problems and bring in a utopia through our scientific abilities, our technical abilities, but inevitably our humanity bumps up against that. And basically, but utopias are built on various forms of technocracy.
Yeah, and I can see the paideia side of that in a lot of high romantics,
Yes,
like Coleridge and Wordsworth, and
sure.
I often find solace in those type of works. We're going to go into your third point in your Tory manifesto, which is quite short and to the point, but I think that there's a good discussion to be had on it. Tories do not separate ethics from economics. And that's where I've cut that one off, because I would rather have a discussion than read out the whole blurb.
Yeah, so there has been a tendency in the last few centuries, accelerated, of course, in which the ledger and profit of loss is the main criteria for determining what is the good, the true, and beautiful. And when this happens, we become moral cripples, essentially. And so as a result of the economics, sort of the god of economics, dominating, one victim of that is the environment, ecological. So we can, as it were, bring down forests, pollute oceans, build dams, the impact on that, relocate people, as long as, the GNP is soaring well like a rocket ship. But there are serious implications ecologically of only thinking economically. And a Tory is always interested. Interestingly, the two words eco in both of them come from the Greek oikos, which means home, and economics comes from economos, which means what's the order for a good home so that one lives safely and properly over the long haul. Ecology is just the oikos, the logos. What is the word that we should all hear in learning to live in the tensions between care for the earth and proper stewardship of the economy, or sustainable development is one of the terms that's often used. But what's happened often, you get people in the environmental movement are sometimes a little soft on economic issues, and economic people are often quite daft when it comes to the implications of their policies, their actions on the environment itself. And so meaningful thinking in terms of economy, ecology, there's this ongoing tension. And if we subordinate one to the other either way, there are serious social, political, economic implications. A Tory is always grappling with both sides. This is why a Tory, in the one sense, can seem on the right, honoring the role of business. On the other hand, they can be on the left when they see what business is doing to the physical world and to other people. And so you get Toryism go right and go left. So we'll get later to say blue conservatism, which is about business. Well, there's a legitimacy of commerce and trading, but when it is daft and blind to the implications of what it's doing to people or to the environment, then a Tory will swing off over to the ecological side. But ideology often splits people between economy or ecology, and a Tory would say this is silly reaction. But again, the tension, the living with the two together, which makes it more difficult than simple reductionism.
So a Tory would be dismissive of the the naive environmental activist warrior, but would also be very critical of the capitalist oil tycoon with little regard for the environment, and it's very important to distinguish that.
Yeah, so very critical of the captains of
Yeah.
industry, as Carlyle would talk. I mean, a classic illustration you mentioned earlier, Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Sully. So they're up in the Lake District, and meanwhile, to the east of the Lake District in England is Manchester, Birmingham. They're belching out pollution.
Mm-hmm.
The land is being, uh, in that sense, poison, toxins are getting it. So just to the west of them is the Lake District, where you have Wordsworth and Coleridge and Southey. They're the lead environmentalists in terms of seeing where this industrial revolution is going and the implications of it. And so even Wordsworth, near the end of his life, when they were trying to put trains into the Lake District, he's up there with placards protesting the steam engines and the coal burning things out and what it does to people. So yeah, so you'll find a Tory will sometimes, they seem to be on the right, but then they'll switch over to the left and then they'll switch over to the right. It's a tension.
Well, I mean, we saw this in George Grant, right? Like he was
Yes.
at the same time he was bailing out students who were draft dodgers, right? And at the same time he was radically against abortion with his.
Yeah.
I do believe he did a biography on Margaret Sanger.
Pardon me?
George Grant, he did a biography on Margaret Sanger. Was that correct? At some
No,
point?
no,
No?
no, I don't think so. No.
Okay, that's my bad. Anyway,
But he was, as you say, he was the right and left didn't know what to do with him because
yeah.
in the 50s and 60s, he's critiquing American imperialism, CIA operations, military industrial complex, Vietnam, Cold War. So this seemed to place on the new left, but then he's also taking positions on pro-life and is concerned with the runaway euthanasia and the breakdown of traditional family values and the importance of religion contra secularism.
Mm-hmm. No, it's the thing with Tories is that they can seem that they're dodging the issue in terms of those who have an ideological perspective. Just because they're always trying to live in the middle of the tension to find the best path.
Yeah, but if a person's a reductionistic ideologue, then of course a Tory can seem as if they're waffling. You're not on the right or the left, but why should you be on the right or the left? I mean, what divine fiat from Sinai had says you have to be right or left? It's a bit like in Jesus's time saying, well, Jesus, are you a Pharisee or a Sadducee? Well, I'm neither. Well, you must be a zealot. No, I'm not that either. Well, are you a member of the dead? Are you the Essene? No, I'm not that either. Are you Herodian? But there's a human tendency in smaller minds to say you've either got to be this or that, black and white. It's a Manichaean, Gnostic way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And a Tory, in some ways, attempts to free people from those two cages.
I know it's a very nuanced position, and I think that's why we're going into it so heavily today. Okay, the fourth point. This is more of the high romantic point, so let's focus in on them for a little bit. Fourth, the English high romantics, for instance, Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Southey, were deeply conservative, and their high Tory conservatism led them to not only oppose the economics that was dominating the political scene at the time, but equally the way of the captains of industries that were destroying the environment for crude and short-sighted notion of profit. So I think we've already discussed this point pretty well.
Yeah, and
anything
what
else
would
to add to it?
Yeah, so for example, yeah, we landed on it lightly there a few minutes back. But perhaps one thing to note is sometimes romantics are all folded into one category. And I use the high Tories of Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Southey to contrast them with the extreme individualism and reactionary tendencies of the low romantics of Shelley, Keats, Byron, and Blake. They are very modern and individualistic in many ways. What high Tories and low Tories question is one, runaway capitalism that pollutes the earth, and an uncritical attachment to a certain form of science as the only way of knowing, and a narrow view of rationalism. So high and low share certain concerns about the right wing of the Enlightenment, but they part companies. One is more commonweal, the common good. The other is anarchist and very individualistic, which interestingly puts the low romantic over to the right side of the spectrum whereas the high Tory remains with that organic notion of the past, present, the future, and the living community in the existential present.
No, it's always interesting to see how these historical figures fit into the way we understand ourselves in our current day. Most people don't even think of themselves as a continuation of great deeds done by great people. Right? They just see themselves.
We are all children of history, and once people start, if they do start thinking in a minimally meaningful way, they have internalized a narrative of the past. And that narrative is always usually a mix of gold and dross, wheat and chaff. And as the purpose of university, or at least minimal thinking, is to say, what have I inherited from the past that I'm aware of that is good? What is problematic? And you begin the process of thinking. This is why history, intellectual history, is very important in culture and literature and music and all these great civilization and cultural things. They allow us to slip into a polyphonic dialogue, and they enrich, they deepen, and they draw forth from us things we're not even aware of, or places we haven't gone to in our own soul or mind and imagination that are perhaps our culture silences or censors in that sense. And this is why being immersed in the best of a good education, it allows people not to be taken captive by the tribes and clans of the right, left, or center.
Can we have some examples of things that our culture censors it doesn't really talk about in terms of university?
Well, I mean, obviously at the present time, we can see the obvious and intense clashes between the progressives on the one hand that essentially say these are the issues you line up behind, this is how you interpret the issues, and people feeling, well, critical think, I mean, even though liberalism talks about critical thinking, when you go too far down that ideological progressive route, you end up having to goose step on a whole range of issues. And minimally thoughtful people say, well, surely life is more complicated than that. And when they're shut down from critical thinking, then they will spin off to the other side and go into reactionary conservatism because they feel they're not being listened to in a classroom or a university environment. So one extreme midwifes the other. The right can midwife the left, and the left can midwife the right. And we can see that sort of melodrama being played out in public education, culture wars, politics all over, where people, plant their flags and they don't think beyond their small little circle in which the flag sits.
No, that's for sure. I've seen many people who jump political ideologies quite quickly and rapidly without really dwelling on the roots of where these ideas are coming from. The fifth point, I think it's also relatively well and timely for our current day. Tories do not separate and artificially oppose state and society.
Yes, and so that's the how do you start spelling out or fleshing out the ideals or the ideas or the principles of Toryism into practical politics. Now, often as a person moves further down the right, politically, economically, socially, the state is seen as the problem. And we're right now moving into provincial politics and obviously across the 49th American presidential politics. But those on the conservative or Republican right, whether there's Trump or not, he will come and go like anybody does in time. There's a great suspicion of the state and its incursion in people's personal lives or in the marketplace or higher taxes or distributing goods, and this fear of the state, which is a very American way of thinking, given it's cutting the umbilical cord from Europe, whether England or France or whatever. And so it's this hyper-individualism that fears the good element of the state. There's obviously negative elements of the state as well. And Tory would say you have to be on guard constantly for, excessive taxation, bureaucracy, excessive administration. And so the society or grassroots work is very important. A Tory would never, negate that in any way, but there's limitations to what that can accomplish. The other side is to flip over to the state is the deliverer of all goods, so it becomes a Messiah-like figure. Well, a Tory would critique that also, but the state does have important goods it can deliver for citizens to provide a minimal civilized human, existence, such as, universal health care, a national broadcasting system, protection of parks, environment, good roads, police, all these basic things that society just can't do. It doesn't have that capacity to carry that on. So a Tory will take the position, again, state and society deliver goods, but they're also limited in the goods they can deliver. So it's a dance together. It's like Bunyan's, he footed it well and she answered him handsomely. It's like a wedding at its best, where the spouses live together, but ideologues of the right or left, one elevates and idealizes the state and is not willing to critique its blind spots. The other idealizes society, and without recognizing there are serious limitations in what society can deliver, either in aid or charity organizations, or what the market itself can lead to terrible injustice. You just have to read Dickens novels, or Marx is good on that, Disraeli, and so a Tory would say you need both. You need both working together, and that involves good citizenship. People that don't demonize one or the other or slip into sort of kindergarten ways of understanding. Their mind becomes fairly simplistic, and a Tory recognizes the tensions and the dance involved.
Yeah. Well, I think in particular in American politics, this is made so explicit because of the dualism in the parties, right? It's because there's only two parties, tribalism becomes such a explicit factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And the positive thing, obviously, about the Canadian experience, we never cut the umbilical cord with the English and the French tradition, the European tradition, broadly speaking, and our own First Nations tradition had certainly a notion of the community, the common good. We have three narratives or stories which perpetually inform us of the importance of the individual and community. But the danger always is that Gnostic Manichaean mindset, which just black and white, right and wrong, no nuance. Whereas life is about nuance. It's about parsing. It's about understanding how what seem to be disparate and irreconcilable opposites actually work together when understood for the common good of one and all. But lesser people who refused, as it were, to go up to those upper ridges and summits and see the big picture, they end up shrinking things to their little acreage of their mind, or their few little friends who sit around campfires together and scratch one another's backs and say, this is the way things should be. And of course, nobody listens to them in any meaningful sense anyway. So if you're going to do politics or culture in a meaningful level, the mind and imagination has to be lifted to a much higher level.
Well, that's the problem with tribalism. They retreat to their groups of utter positivism, and that's all they ever get, right? Yeah. So when they have that negative reaction, it's often a violent and guttural reaction. Let's move on to the sixth point, being, if a Tory is concerned with the commonweal, such a concern leads to a concern for the commons. Now that can be expanded on quite a bit, I believe.
Yeah, so the commonweal can not only be applied to, say, economic issues and educational issues and healthcare issues, commonweal. Commons is also, do we as a people, do we as a country create physical space in which, whether it's parks or, areas that we all can share, so that things are not reduced to just private property and people live in their own, as it were, little private dwellings, and there's no meaningful connection or relationship to others as people isolate not only the notion of individualism, but then the property and possessions that protect our individualism. The notion of the commons is that we come out of our private little places and we share as a people physical landscape, physical land. And even in Canada recently, the last few decades, our government has been very weak on protecting parks and the importance of the commons for people coming to those, whether provincial parks or local parks or federal parks. And these are meant for the health and healing of people. I mean, people who sort of lose their souls in an urban setting and do not get out and be with others in larger areas of the commons that we share together, they lose something of their humanity in the process. And it is the role of the government and society to create those spaces which we all share in common, not only for people to be there, but also to protect them from pollution and what they can do to people's lungs and health and other elements of society. Impact on animals, obviously, as well.
So do you think the Tory notion of commons is an older notion, like from like the traditional, for instance, like a church, right? Like this is what the traditional role of the church was and is for the longest time. And do you think that carried over into the British common idea?
Oh, sure. For example, like even say a church, as in say Anglicanism, it's not called a church, it's called a parish. It comes from para oikos, Latin, which means not just the people who attend a building, but a parish is a large area that people share in common, of which the church is a part. But the church and its liturgy and its Eucharistic tradition and its mass and its seasons, it's part of the commons that one and all share, which is both religious, but it's serving one another economically. It's being there for families as they're going through difficult times. It's a broad area that one and all, even though they have their own private dwellings, they also have public realities that connect them, that knit them together as people. So definitely parish, commons, commonweal, common good, commonwealth. These are all classical terms by which a Tory understands how one lives in community for the greater good of one and all.
All right. Let's move on to the seventh point, Ron. This one's on education. This is the one I have the most quips with. So education is not about being grounded in is about being grounded in the best that has been thought, has been said, and has been done in the past.
Yeah, so I mean, that quote essentially comes from Matthew Arnold in terms of what a very important 19th century thinker who tried to live in the tensions. His father was a headmaster of one of the leading English schools. But yeah, so education is immersing people in the best that has been thought, said, and done. It's the formation of the imagination in the mind of the soul, so that as people enter into the public realm, as they become citizens, they don't do so in a silly or reactionary way. They have all of the past living within them, and they see if you go down a certain path, it's a cliff's edge. If you go another, you're going to drown, as it were, in the public square. So how does the best that has been thought, said, and done in the past become a teacher or a mentor in that sense, or an ama or an abba, as people get the education? And then how is how is that finally drawn out as people become public servants in the public square in that sense? But if education is only training in technical skills, a person can have a BA in technical skills. They're not educated. They've just mastered, whether an electrician or whether a lawyer or whether a dentist or whether a plumber. These people, they may have BAs and MAs. They're not educated in the sense of paideia or humanities in that sense. They've just learned a skill. But what you do with that skill, that's the big human question. People can use it to indulge, to make big money, to go on expensive vacations, or it can be used for service. And so best education is about learning wisdom and what that means for citizenship, just not knowledge for the purpose of learning a technique and then, indulging yourself. And of course, the more training you get paid more, but it's just technique is technique, and doesn't mean a person's educated in any minimal sense. And so a Tory is very interested. They're not contra technique. They just recognize that it's very secondary to a meaningful education, citizenship, and the human soul on our journey. It has to be about paideia and wisdom and insight and justice, these things that make us human.
So do you think one of the things that I've noticed in liberal education is that there's a hyper segregation of traditional humanities fields, which used to be completely interconnected, right? So I think that's something that I've seen, and I think that's probably a reason why people are only educated in one field of a humanity in a humanities study, but not rather in all of them, which is what the heart of the humanities should be.
Yeah, humanities is about an integrative way that transcends the siloism of disciplines. And so the dilemma of a person, they go into literature, they go into economics or political science or psychology or, whatever. Then there's this notion, well, I go down a path and that's what my degree is in, but they're not taught to integrate all these different disciplines into a unified way of looking. That's what a university was once about, universitas, the one truth you're moving toward in which all these disciplines integrate. Now we're in a multiveritas in which people just have perspectives. So what I think happens is, in one sense, elements of humanity have slit their own throat by saying there is no truth. It's just perspective. We just make up reality. It's human, hermeneutical generosity. It's just perspective. It's just conditioning. So that's driven people, I think, to the hard sciences or to commerce or how I get a degree in computer science, because there's certainty, but the price you pay for certainty is you ignore the most important things in life, but it's the dilemma as humanities has tended to, as I said, slit its own throat by its perpetual fragmentation, and elements of postmodernism and late modernity have contributed to that. So it drives people to the other side as well. If they can't make sense of anything, then I'm just going to get a job or learn some skills, technique, which will give me money. And that's my education. That's all I'm interested in. Thank you.
Well, this goes back to the Grecian idea of monist worldview or a pluralist worldview in terms of their theological understanding of themselves. Right, like for instance, Plato and Aristotle, they valued monism, right? But then as the Athenian polis weakened and the Roman influence grew stronger, it became more of a pluralist worldview that varied and changed with whatever emperor took over.
Yeah, when you lose any, and of course, one of the great critiques philosophically has come against the Platonic Aristotelian theological, or it's just the Western. It's just not a Greek. It's a classical Western understanding. So, if you want someone like Alistair MacIntyre should be read in terms of After Virtue, or even George Grant, for that matter, is a Canadian thinker in that area. But yeah, once you start undermining minimal teleology, then everyone creates their own ever-shifting liquid teleology, which will change like we change clothes.
Yeah.
And then it's what Yeats saw very clear: the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. And that's then you're getting the breakdown of a civilization and a culture when nothing can be held together and everything is doubted. People are cynical, skeptical about everything. Now we're back into the sophists in that sense, which Plato and Aristotle were very critical of.
Well, that's why if you have hundreds of thousands of opposing worldviews, then the only accurate worldview you can take is hypertolerance, and then you become intolerant of intolerance.
Yes, yeah.
Right, and that's the current problem of the secular age, I think. Because how do we reconcile the shift in our moral context? We can't unless we come to a common understanding. In part, that's what this podcast is about, right? It's to discuss these bigger theological issues. And number 8 on the list is, according to the Tory's view of human nature, we are imperfect, finite, and fallible beings, which is an excellent counter to utopianism.
Yes, so Tory starts with 3 elements. We're finite, we're fallible, and we're prone to narcissism. Bring those 3 things together, then there's a sense of humility emerges, rather than a dogmatic certainty of intellectual, political, economic decisions. And with that recognition, we're quite willing to, on the one hand, Tory recognize the ambiguity within themselves. This is what great myth is all about, of course, is that Plato would talk about the 2 horses, the dark and the light horse. The Christian tradition is the notion of original sin. decode any of that. It's essentially it's that we're finite, fallible, and we can make decisions that hurt ourselves, harm ourselves and others, and the body politic. And we also can do amazingly wonderful things as well. But it is this tension within the human soul, within human nature, that it always warns a Tory on the one hand about people ideologically being certain without any sense of self-reflection, self-criticism, but also the utopian builders. And so certainly within the last few hundred years, we've seen a variety of benign utopian experiments, but also much larger, epic, obviously utopian experiments that have led to the deaths of millions of people. In terms of humans building, there's a beautiful book that's recently come out. It's called Icarus Fallen. And it's the story of humanity being the Icarus. They reach for the heavens in terms of bringing in the utopia, but then Icarus, as the Greeks wisely warn us, will fall. You get too close to the sun of reality, the wings are going to melt.
You can look at any major revolution, barring maybe the American Revolution, and look at the failed rationalist utopia of France, and the failed communist revolution of Russia.
Yeah, I would also, I think you can bring in elements of the French Revolution, Russian, but I would say the American experiment also, the American Revolution, and then of course the Civil War that follows.
Yes.
Was one of the reasons Canada was formed, because it saw what was happening to the south of us. But there's a utopianism in the founding of the United States with its notion of it was leaving behind the old world.
Yes.
That could not be reformed. France could not be, England could not be reformed. The Puritans were going to build a new utopia, a new Jerusalem. So America has fallen into exactly the same Icarus temptation as the French, did the Russians, and of course, to this day, you can see that working itself out. It's a subtler version than the crude, obviously, Siberia, which Solzhenitsyn so well, or obviously the terrible elements of the French Revolution. But there is an Icarus tendency in the American soul, and their history is replete with terrible violence.
Well, that's why the Constitution is so focused on minimal government, right? Because otherwise you risk having the greatest failures happen again, but at the same time you're risking a Caesar type of situation, right?
Yeah, and we can see across the border, obviously, I mean, Plato in books 8 and 9 of the Republic, he predicts very clearly where you go from, aristocracy to timocracy to plutocracy to democracy to tyranny. And what's happened across the border, you can see Plato anticipating. And remember, aristocracy for Plato is not about landed aristocracy. It's about arete, the women and men of character ruling, not people of born into wealth and plenty. A very different understanding of arete, or the ruling of the guardian.
So my understanding of arete is people of honor and character and wisdom, a balance between techne and paideia, as we've talked about, making the ruling decisions.
Yeah, so arete can be found both in technique, men and women who have mastered a skill in a highly developed and mature manner. They're people of arete in terms of skill. But there's also women and men of arete of character. So you look at Mahatma Gandhi, for example. This was a person who technically probably wouldn't have been too proficient, but in terms of his character, albeit imperfect, everyone's imperfect, but there was a level, of character in something like that. And so there's many other people I could mention, women and men, but that arete always applied to both techne and paideia. And as those two came together for the Polish, you would have a just, and this is what the Republic is always about, justice. Not justice as power, justice as contract, but justice as, women and men of character ruling, also who are skilled in their different abilities.
Which is vastly important.
Yes.
All right. So now the 9th point of the 10 points. Tories are convinced that the foundation stones of a good state are built with bricks of ethical firmness and religious depth.
Yeah, so there has certainly been in the last few centuries two wings that, again, a Tory would be wary of. One would be the rise of a form. Certainly, the French Revolution initiates this in a very graphic and not to be forgotten way, a utopian secularism.
Yes.
In which the Roman Catholic Church was evil. Well, it's similar to when it's Luther critiquing the Roman Catholic Church. All the French Revolution did was secularize Luther, that's all.
Yeah.
So Luther critiqued the Catholic Church. The French did the same, but they then turned against religion as the answer. Luther just tried to revise religion. The French Revolution. So you really get in the elements of the French Revolution this notion of secularism as a dominant cultural political ideology in which religion is the evil. And you move along, and of course, Marx, religion is the opiate of the people. You get Nietzsche's critique of it. You get Freud's. The 19th century, sort of the progressives were all moved in a secularist direction, and religion was the problem that people had to be free from. The reaction the other way, of course, we see around us in the Middle East today, is theocracies, in which you have rulers who claim to speak for God, and you get that across the border as well, is obviously in Iran, Saudi Arabia, and many of these other states. So between secularism and theocracy, there's a legitimate place for people asking big questions about spirituality, the human journey. What is more? Is there more than just the finite? Are we just going to milk the udder of the finite for meaning, and then we milk the udder dry? Is that all there is? The little merry-go-round of the secular and the finite. It's like Augustine in the Confessions, begins, "Our hearts are restless, O God, until they rest in you." So a Tory is as much concerned with the vertical element of the journey as the horizontal element of the journey, the secular and the sacred. And again, you're in the middle between a dangerous theocracy and a dangerous secularism, and living again in the attentions of the secular, the sacred, and again, needing to be nimble and wise in that, because there's a lot of foolish people who move in the direction of religion, just as there's a bunch of foolish and silly people, such as the new atheists, who move and perpetuate a narrow view of anti-religion.
Well, you also had the more critical thinkers of the 20th century, like Carl Jung and T.S. Eliot, offering a more nuanced approach to the importance of religion. Like Jung was more so about the symbology in meaning, and T.S. Eliot was Anglican.
Well, yeah, I mean, there has obviously been a whole thoughtful, critical response to theocracy and secularism. So people like a Jung, in his interaction with the Freud, this was the whole issue of archetypes, the importance of collective unconscious, spirituality, myth. Obviously, you get a T.S. Eliot, Four Quartets, a brilliant work. You have many of the finest theologians of the 20th century engaging these 19th century thinkers who were secularists. And so anyone who enters this larger science, religion, secularism, sacred, it's a massive dialogue that's been going on, and lesser people reduce it to simple little formulas without entering into the large conversation in the last 200 years.
Well, that's where you get a simplistic type of Gnosticism in like shallow forms of Buddhism, for instance. Yes. Or spiritualism is something that we're seeing quite often, and it's not often a serious, in-depth view of a deeper significance. It's just something to make them feel like they've accomplished something in the community. A lot of that comes down to Memori's side. You have a lot of voyeurs or dilettantes. Well, I'm a Buddhist, and you say, well, tell me. I mean, I've taught courses upper level in Buddhism for years, and you ask them, well, what have you read, or what's your understanding? It's usually, it's infantile, but what underneath it is they're longing for something more than secularism can deliver, and they're wary of certain types of religion, such as theocratic or fundamentalists, that don't speak to them. And so the psychological longing is valid. Where they're going and how they're making sense of it, it tends to be pretty paper thin. Well, it's also often reactionary to yes. things that they've experienced but not truly understood.
Yeah.
And often the case is you have to handle those people where they're coming from to make any progress.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, you have to be. I mean, if people have come from painful experiences in
yes.
religion, their concerns are valid, and they have to be honored. But often, what happens when a person has been hurt badly, they'll often throw the good out with the bad. They
Mm-hmm.
generalize their own experience without thinking more deeply about it in the broader, in this case, religion they may be coming for. They've experienced the negative side of it without recognizing the reason these things exist is because they speak to the human soul and spirit and longing for a much more epic vision of life. So, but the initial reaction to certain stage is quite understandable and legitimate. One would hope they'd mature and, you know, go to the mother lode and the gold mine eventually. But some people get stuck just going round and round in the same circle. It's like a bad DVD or a bad CD in their head. And at a certain point, someone has to come along and say, okay, you've played that so many times, you know, you've shrunken as a human being. Let's pull that out of the soul, the CD, and move forward.
Or it's the butterfly effect from all the little delights of life without really ever tasting a flower.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, yeah. So they become spiritual butterflies.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the final point. Tories are committed to the notions that there is a good, a better, and a best, and equally so, there are such things as bad, worse, and worst.
Yeah, so there is the human tendency. I think touched on it a few times in our reflections, is to want to reduce life to black, white, right, wrong categories rather than nuancing things. So on the one hand, you have people who particularly get interested in politics, they have ideals, perfect ideals, and then the perfect becomes the enemy of the good. Because some perspective is not actualized, then I'm going to drop out, or people become cynical in that sense without recognizing there is good, better, best, there is bad, worse, worse. And sometimes you have to, in voting or whatever, you're not going to get the perfect, but what party, what person can bring about minimal goods, if not better goods, or move the ship at least further from the shoreline of perspectives which are hurt and harmful to people economically, ecologically, educationally, religiously, sports, whatever. So, I mean, there are obviously situations in life which are right and wrong,
Mm.
in which a person has to be clear that this is not acceptable. I've just been going over and preparing a couple lectures for next week on a very important German thinker who actually did the main work on Paideia, his 3 volumes. He was a classical scholar in Germany, one of the top classical scholars. And by the mid-1930s, he became very clear that there was something wrong here, rise of Nazism and fascism. And so he does a brilliant lecture in 36, University of Berlin, on Demosthenes. Werner Jager, I'm talking about. You might know him through the Paideia. Very Catholic in his thinking, just not Paideia. He was a very prolific writer. But I mean, a situation like that, you have to say this is evil. So he gives this very important lecture at Berlin on Demosthenes, who was in Greek context seeing where things were going. And of course, he's whisked out of Germany quite quickly. They bring him to Chicago and then Harvard. But there are situations in life where you say, this is right, this is wrong, this is where I stand, and this is... and it's knowing when you're in that historic context, what Heidegger would talk about our thrownness, but when you're also in more subtler contexts where you're grappling with good, better, best, perfect, bad, worst, worse, and then how do you navigate in those more tricky waters on the ship of the soul, the ship of state. And so it's knowing how these different epistemological ways of knowing operate in different historic contexts. And so there has to be a certain nimbleness. A Tory would argue a certain nimbleness of knowing what wave are you surfing.
Well, you have to be very nuanced, or you're gonna end up like Oswald Spengler or Heidegger with the attractions to potential radicalism and dangerous
Yes.
and dangerous, very temperate and violent ideologies as they arise. So you always have to be vigilant where you are in your society and what are they doing with pluralist or monist type teleological thought, and you have to get that type of wisdom as you go on.
Yeah.
So, all right, so Ron, that is the end of the 10 points to your Tory manifesto.
Oh.
Only 16 minutes over, but that's okay. I have 2 questions for you as follow-ups, and that is the difference between a blue Tory and a red Tory.
Okay, so might be best. I often distinguish between blue conservative and then red Tory. Because in many ways, blue conservatives are not Tories. And you'll get these, obviously, blue conservatives would be the Conservative Party of Canada, Republican in the States. They're usually what they call first-generation liberals. They want freedom of religion, freedom of denominations, freedom of worship, freedom of the marketplace. It's freedom. It's whether it's economics, whether it's religion, whether it's private schools, it's freedom, liberty. So, and this is one of the basic premises of liberalism is freedom, liberty, and equality. So you follow that sort of conservatism. What's called conservatives, they're really conserving 16th, 17th century thinking. In terms of the principles of liberty. They only want the content to go so far. Of course, second generation liberalism and third generation will push it further. And so when you get blue conservatism, it really just continues the sacred versus the secular. Okay, so we uphold religion against the encroaching elements of secularism, upholds religious pluralism, upholds the competitive marketplace or business, wants lighter taxes, wants lighter state. It's all about freedom. The freedom for, and what interferes with your freedom? It's the state, okay? Or unions interfere with your freedom.
Yep.
And so if you go too far down, women interfere with men's freedom to rule. It depends where you want to go, or the environment interferes with your right to pollute it, because you continue making money, it can have an impact on the physical. So blue conservatives are really what we call first generation liberals of the Lockean, the Protestant tradition, in which liberty is held high, and it's not a very Tory position at all. It's really a 16th, 17th century invention, which had a huge impact on the United States, much less on Canada, because we didn't wean ourselves. We didn't cut the umbilical cord from England and France in quite the same way as the Americans.
Well, unless you're from Alberta.
Well, sure, yeah. Alberta has always been our closest to that republicanism, and of course, the Conservative Party of Canada comes out of that Manning tradition. Ernest Manning, Preston Manning, Stockwell Day, and then Harper moves there, and so yes, Alberta has always been our most American province, but gratefully so, Canada is bigger than Alberta.
Yeah, well, that's me, all right.
Yeah.
All right. And then what's the red Tory difference from a blue conservatism?
So red Tory comes along. It came about in the 1960s when George Grant was interacting with Gad Howardts, a very important political scientist in Canada, taught at major university in Ontario. And Howardts didn't know what to do with Grant because he was a Tory, but he was for a stronger state, higher taxes. He critiqued Goldwater. He critiqued the notion of a lighter state. He was very much against, big businesses, believed in the role of the state in providing goods for one and all. And so for someone like Howardts, this isn't a conservative from his understanding of the word in terms of American republicanism. So Howardts, friends of his, called those Tories red, because red, of course, you think left, common good. But at that period of time of the new left, of which Howardts and Laxer were all a part, they were what you would call red nationalists. So Grant was very suspicious because he was not red. He was a high Tory, not a red Tory. So red nationalists were similar to elements of Marxism or socialism, where the state takes over the means and owns the means of production. Grant would say, no, hold on here. State and society work together here, and there's nothing wrong with privatization, but be careful if it goes too far down one way. You get this same thinking in of course, Stephen Leacock's little book on the unsolved riddle of social justice, in which he looks at both the pros of the right, the blind spots of the right, the pros of the left, the blind spots of the left. And Grant anyway stands on the shoulders of Stephen Leacock in that sense. So he's and some of these points we mentioned in our 10 points, they are in a sense the congealed embodied form of high Toryism versus red Toryism on the left and blue Toryism on the right. And historic Canadian thinking is high Toryism. And that's what built this country, the John A. Macdonalds, the Diefenbakers. You read some of the writings of some of these people, you think they're, way off to the left at times, And so Grant, Leacock, and there's a whole tradition here that goes way back, very suspicious of the emergence of the United States, the violence in its founding, the Civil War. Some of our great novelists like Maza de la Roche, Stephen Leacock, Robertson Davy. There's a whole range of them. Canadians have always been suspicious of the underlying philosophical foundation of the United States, with its elevation of liberty, and any sort of order or structure interferes with your liberty. Canadians have always seen liberty and order as living in tension, and so we don't have the. Sadly so, it has been accelerating, but we have not had the level of violence as they have had in the United States, because we don't hold liberty isolated and priorize it, which is a very Protestant principle, I might add. Anyone who comes from a Catholic background always is interested in the relationship of structure and liberty and order. And liberty pushed too hard destroys, it deconstructs everything. So interesting, Protestantism and the forming of the United States, that's the beginning of postmodernism and deconstructionism. So people want to say, no, postmodernism just emerged a lot. No. You just go look at the Protestant Reformation. That deconstructs a whole civilization, including Catholicism. French Revolution deconstructs religion. The American Revolution deconstructed essentially all the great forms that hold civilization together, and liberty is held high. So Protestant Reformation, French Revolution, American Revolution, these are all deconstructionist movements with no meaningful solution to commonweal order and goodness.
Yeah, so the high Tory tradition, to be a high Tory, is to live in the constant tension of all these different options, whether that's economic or in terms of religious / social order, these types of issues, always living in that tension to find the best path or the best or better, I should say, paths is really the high Tory position at its finest.
Yeah, not easy. Lesser people want simple Gnostic answers, Manichaean answers. Living in the tensions calls forth greater maturity from the soul and the mind and the imagination. But it's much easier to become more Cyclops-like, become one-eyed in that sense, or one-dimensional, whereas a Tory, the very worldview is living in multiple tensions, which is more difficult for people who want simplistic answers to life's troubling and ambiguous, mysterious questions that come our way in the human journey.
No, for sure. All right, Ron. Thank you. This has been a great episode. I'd just like to say the 10 points were from Ron's book, The North American High Tory Tradition. It's a good read. I'd also like to say that Stephen Leacock's Unsolved Riddles of Social Justice is a good introductory read to the issues of socialized justice theory. More modern day ideas of this would be seen in race theory, but it's a good start. Once again, Ron, if you would like to say anything before I say good night to you.
Well, the sun is setting. It is now dusk, so perhaps we part. We've lived in the light for the last hour, and darkness now settles in.
Yeah, it was a very good interview. Thank you so much, Ron, and I hope to be talking to you again. All right.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks
All
so
right.
much.
Bye, everybody. All right.